Welcome everybody to Bainbridge Arts and Crafts on a lovely Saturday in the Pacific Northwest. I'm very happy today to introduce Brandy Agan, Peter Koronakis, and Liz Gamberg, who are three artists in our group show that we're calling Introducing, all fairly new artists to the gallery. We're very excited to show them and such a range of work. So these folks are here to share more about their work and process, and I'm gonna nudge things along by asking questions here and there, and please feel free, you folks in the audience, to ask questions as well. So we'll get started. A general question, and maybe I'll start with Peter. What attracted you to the process that you use, assemblage, and the materials that you find and put together in inventive ways?
Very good question. For me, the process of making animal sculptures starts with the materials. That's one of the fun parts, is I get to go to antique stores and garage sales and wherever I can find the pieces. And the pieces that speak to me are pieces that show patterns of wear. It's someone's rolling pin that they've used for 50 years, or it's a worn piece of steel, it's a piece of wood that's weathered. I started working with these materials about 20 years ago. It's an interesting story. My wife attended a big giant antique mart in a community in California called Moss Landing. And they closed the town, and they had this giant town-wide antique store fair. And she came back with a story of what was a pig sign, a trade sign outside of probably a meat market 20 years ago. And it just, that for some reason struck me that I wanted to make animal sculptures in a folk art manner. My wife and I both have a great interest in folk art, so it kind of all came together with the subject matter and the materials.
Do you still have that pig sign?
No, actually, it was about $600 and it was out of our price range.
Ah, too bad. Well, it seems like you're really a storyteller with the way you use materials. You talk about their history and their evidence of use, and I would call Brandy a bit of a storyteller as well, using a very different process in your paintings. Maybe you can describe that aspect of your work.
So many of my paintings, I did a recent series with using the zoo, and my motivation was to really gain a lot of people in painting, which is what I like to do. I'm very influenced by early Renaissance painters who had tremendous battle scenes with all these people and arms flailing around. And not that I would necessarily do that particular scene, but I could go to the zoo, and people are pretty incognito. I can take tons of pictures of people as well as the animals. So my interest was actually in capturing the people observing the animals. And so I take this horde of pictures back, several hundred, and then I usually pick 2 or 3 that are going to function as my environment. And I modify the environment significantly, and then I start going through the pictures that I've taken in Photoshop, and I basically start pasting in people in various positions, clumps of people that come pretty well established that would do really well in the painting. And then I start adding and adding and editing, changing colors of people's clothing, adding patterns where I think I want to add patterns, and always with this idea of making sweeping lines through the painting so that there's a structure, a skeletal structure underneath. And I use fences and trees to provide the horizontals and the verticals, because a bunch of people with, you know, you can do the best you can to clump them together, and I do. You can organize a crowd of people in terms of a clump here and a clump there, maybe 2 or 3 people in front that keeps the eye going around and keeps them from drifting off to the sides or down from the bottom. In some cases, I would put a fence in the back to promote the viewer's eye forward in the picture plane so that they don't go jumping over the fence and into the distant trees and wonder what's back there. So it's almost like building a puzzle in a way when I do these ones that are very heavily populated with people. So that's part of my process.
So are you building a pretty thoroughly resolved Photoshop image first?
Yeah.
And then painting from that?
I do on some of these, like painting like that I do, where there's a lot of people going on. I establish things pretty well. There's always changes. When you go to try and paint what it is that you organize up front, sometimes things get off a little bit. I did one recently where my students posed for me, and the gal's elbow was supposed to go off to the right of the picture plane, and it didn't. So I had to provide some more material for me to get through that little stage, and sometimes colors don't quite work the way I thought they would. I don't mimic necessarily what I paint from observation, but I take advantage of the palette that I have. And I reach colors as best as I can, and sometimes things occur to me during the process where I think, well, this color really is repeated too much. I need a blue right there to, you know, operate in between all of the reds of here, here, and there, because you can use color to trace the eye through the painting as well. So, but then there's paintings where I just sort of wing it, and I'm about ready to do a couple of those. I've got this messy space with my husband's stuff in front of his shop, and I put him in the picture, but I just couldn't wait to jump into that one, and I'll probably do that one on site. I'll probably start it on site, and then I'll, you know, resort to my studio where it's nice and warm when it starts to rain on me, which happens. So.
Well, it's great you're talking about color and your use of color in your work. I know color is very important in what Liz is doing in her work in both fabrics and textiles and also ceramics. And in the exhibition, we primarily have your textiles, but we also carry your ceramics. And I was fascinated to learn that you actually studied and taught mathematics. And I can see how that plays into the abstractions that you use. Maybe, can you speak to that connection?
Yeah, I can try. It's when people hear that I have this math background and I do this art, these pieces, they often say, but math and art, they're opposite ends of the spectrum. And I really don't feel that. I don't feel that. Yeah. It's a little hard to talk about, or to, you know, to put it into words. But there is something about, you know, there's certainly geometry is a place where both of those things meet, but also just sort of intuitively proportions and, you know, especially with collage, the way I do it is I, you know, cut out pieces and move things around until it feels right. And I think that
Like finding a sense of balance in it?
Yeah, asymmetry and balance, both of those things. Because I think too much symmetry, it's just not my thing. But I think finding the balance between balance and asymmetry, and it's just kind of a gut thing. But I do think that those two things are very connected for me. I'm not sure what else to say.
Have you had mentors in your life from either of those worlds, or both of those worlds, that have kick-started paths you've taken?
I've taken workshops and art workshops and classes, but I'm really self-taught. But I've been doing it for a very long time. So I think, over time you just kind of get a sense of yourself and your style. You just develop over time. I also design rugs that are made in Nepal, and I use, over there, because two of my pieces are over there. My designs travel among mediums. So, and I use my collage. I have my collages also printed onto floor mats, doormats, towels, pot holders, cards, calendars. I like things that people interact with every day, and so I just keep finding new ways to make that happen.
Well, it certainly lends itself to multiple media, the kind of designs that you work with. And on the topic of mentors or inspirations, I'll go back to Peter. You were talking about folk art being a big influence. Are there particular artists in that world that speak to you? I mean, there's probably a lot you can pick up, I would imagine.
None that I can think of offhand. Most of the folk artists who I've seen are just ordinary people who don't have necessarily any artistic training.
The things you've come across in your travels. And
it's the admiration of someone who isn't trained or isn't from that world making art. That's the appeal to me.
Great. And your inspiration is very fine art, historically referenced.
Yeah. It's funny. I was one that always drew as a kid, and when I finally decided to toss away my previous career and go into art full time, I jumped into a traditional atelier. There's private little schools where you basically learn under a master artist who has been trained themselves that way, and so forth and so on. And I was delighted coming out with the skills of a classically trained painter, thinking that would be what I would do, and I would, paint the president's portrait someday or something. But it turned out that really wasn't quite my voice. As I graduated, I started doing my own work. I really wanted more. I wanted more imagination. I was enticed more by the color shapes and I wanted flatter shapes. So I started looking at my paintings more of a design and less of real technical accuracy and observational accuracy. I'm enamored by people who can paint with that skill, but it's not quite my voice. And now I'm struggling with how to find myself with all this training. I no sooner put a swatch of paint through a perfectly painted person, and I had this little angel on one side and the devil on the other going, do it, and the angel goes, don't you dare. And so it's a bit of a struggle right now to force myself to get past the pure skill, the pure training that I have, and to open up and realize where my voice really is. And it actually leaps way back to medieval art. I really enjoy those pictures that they painted in the old Giotto is a really good example of a painter who was just breaking away from the real stark medieval art that you would see, where it was very formalized, and then started to try and round the forms a little bit and be a little bit more naturalistic, but didn't quite get there. So you had people in the front being as, small, out of proportion with respect to what's going on behind them and so forth and so on. And of course there's the people floating in the skies on clouds and things that just really can't happen, but I find it so enchanting. And the design is so rewarding to me to look at. And so that is playing a much stronger role now for me in my pictures. And I will really be interested to see where I go in the next 10 years. I've been painting just past about the 10-year point, and I'm still hovering towards much more traditionalism. So I want to hang on to the drawing skills, but I want to play with it now. I want to put in some abstraction and twist things around so that people understand what they're looking at, but they're pleasantly surprised by having abstract qualities in the work to look at as a design. Because I think what captures people a lot, or at least for me personally, when I look at a piece of work, I'm attracted to the shapes and the design and the colors, harmony, and the balance and the asymmetry combined in the picture that keeps making me want to look at it. So it isn't about, look at how well that person's lips are painted, can you believe it? It has much more to do with the feeling of the picture and how exciting that picture is just on a visual appeal. So I've gone on and on, so.
Well, I have a question for any of you that feel inspired to answer. Does travel or the different places you've spent time in your life play into the work that you do?
That's a very interesting question. Well, I've always been attracted to folk art museums, of course. My wife and I took a trip about 10 years ago through southern states, Appalachia, Blue Ridge Mountains, and encountered a great deal of very fine crafting by the people, over the generations. That was quite inspirational. I would go back there in a heartbeat. I grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and Chicago is just a short train ride away. I would spend a lot of time at the Chicago Institute of Arts, or is it the Chicago Arts Institute, roaming for hours through their collections of medieval art and impressionists. So that's made a lasting impression on me.
How about you, Liz?
I'm not sure that any one trip has done that for me, but I do find that traveling in general just opens me up, and seeing new things. It doesn't even have to be a big trip, even just but just getting out of my world, and really any kind of traveling can do that. I was in India, I think about 8 years ago, and that's such a completely different environment. And then I was in Spain and Portugal 5 years ago, doing some hiking. But yeah, I think just getting out of my little world does that for me, but I can't think of any specific.
And another question for any of you, or all of you, or one of you. Does teaching play a role in what you do? What did you teach?
My wife and I founded and ran a private Montessori elementary school for 12 years. And we did have a strong arts curriculum. But since I moved on from that, I haven't been into the artistic teaching yet.
I actually do teach. I've taught at a couple of schools in Seattle, one of which was my former alma mater, and then I was an assistant teacher there. And now I just have private instruction in my home. So I have about 5 students that come and participate in their own projects and once a week, and I try and guide them through it. So.
Do the students surprise you with things they come up with sometimes?
Yes, yes. Quite a few. So the students are all over the map in terms of their interests. What has surprised me is how ambitious the projects can be that they want to take on, and they get away with it. That they do. I try, and I have a heavy hand sometimes when they're beginning because I want them to be successful, and it's always mortifying when they do something and it doesn't quite turn out the way they want. Oh no, you just kind of put a little here and put a little there, and they're like, wow. And they come back, and so it's really a pleasure though to watch, and I'm trying really hard not to maybe make the mistake that I did to myself when I went to this very strict school with very strict instruction, but to leave the door open and let them find themselves a little bit. It's okay to stumble around a little bit. Magic can happen out of that. So, but yeah, I have a great crowd of students.
Yeah, I think that's really true, the kind of happy accidents and things that students try that would never have occurred to me. It's like, oh, wow. Yeah, it's kind of fun.
Yes.
And they don't know what they don't know, so they take kind of risks that maybe when you do know a lot about something, you might not take.
Exactly, and there's been a lot of projects that have come up where I'm like, oh my gosh, shit, we don't realize that this is going to be a lot of work. And then halfway into it, they're like, this is a lot of work. But they get through it, and it's the balance between, you have to kind of stomach being a little clumsy quite a while before things, but overall, you do make those improvements and you get better, and I am always there to try and keep complete tragic accidents from happening, so it works out, but it's funny because they kind of inspire me. I myself I'm always thinking, oh, I wish I could be like that again, I'm just going to paint this whole ceiling in my bathroom some year. And it didn't happen, but they have that kind of approach. It's refreshing.
It's on.
It's on.
I have been teaching some collage workshops with one format with a friend of mine who's a writer, and we do writing and collage together, and it's been great. And then I also just do some collage workshops myself. Some are volunteer with some people in Seattle who are in what do you call it? They don't have a lot of money. Mercy Housing they have a couple sites in Seattle, and I've been doing collage with kids, and I will be doing them with adults on those two sites. And then last week I subbed for somebody who had COVID, and did a really fun collage workshop in with a group of colleagues. The supervisor was leaving, and she wanted to do something meaningful and bonding with her group, and it was so much fun. They'd had a little bit of wine before the workshop, which I think helped. But it was really fun. They were just really willing and adventurous, and I tried some things I had never done before in terms of teaching. So I'm really having fun with that as well. Yeah.
That's great. Let's see. And a few people came in after we started, so I just want to encourage folks, if you have questions, to, go right ahead.
I was wondering, for any of you who want to answer, when you start your work, how fully formed of an idea are you starting when you start a piece? And I'm sure it varies, but generally.
Interesting question. For me, it comes pretty quick. I can see the finished animal very soon. And the hard part is going from that state to bring it to fruition. I'm reminded of someone the famous who said, carving in marble is very simple. You see the thing in the block of marble and you just take away all the stone that shouldn't be there. It's sort of that way with me, that I'll, for some reason, have the gift of seeing the finished product and then work towards creating that.
I sometimes have my images fully formed in my mind, and sometimes I don't. It just depends. I've done a couple where I do a lot of scenes in my house, and there's one in particular that I call the entryway, and that whole painting almost painted itself. I knew exactly what I wanted. I posed a student for me and myself entering into my house, and the door being open and capturing the light, and it just fell right out of my paintbrush and then sold. And then there's times where I have no idea what I'm going to do. I always have some idea, but it's nice sometimes to just set your easel up somewhere in the house and start painting and just let it go. And I took a little private workshop with somebody who I really admire, and that was what I did with about 5 pieces. And I hated all of them, but they were really fun. It's just because I think I wasn't very good at that as a technique yet, but it opened up a door for me. So I'm going to be spending more effort at doing pieces that are maybe, they kind of grow organically as you proceed. And those pieces can be started in the middle, and you just sort of find the edges of your canvas as you go. But most of my pieces, I have some kind of framework. I have an idea about what I want in the piece. But I leave room for that person doesn't belong there, I'm getting rid of them, and that kind of thing.
I don't have a very complex answer to this, because I think sometimes I do have a sense of what I'm going to do, and sometimes I really don't. If I'm stuck, sometimes I will just try doing something completely different, or I may go back and do something I've done before, just to get going, just to get flowing and get out of my head. So it really varies for me.
Here's the question.
This is a question for you because you were a trained classical painter. I'm sure you know the painter whose last name is Kendi. I think it's Abraham Kendi, but I'm not sure, who's taken a very formal
Kennedy Wiley.
paintings and then put young black people in them. But they are the same painting,
Kendi
but
Wiley.
they're different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you have the skills to do that. I was wondering if you would ever were inspired by that, to take a very classical painting and change its perspective a little bit. Well, it still looks very classical, but you could say something by doing that. Because that takes an amazing amount of skill.
Right, he painted a portrait of a president.
Yes. He did indeed.
Yeah.
I actually,
Better one.
I did a painting called Shelter. My husband and I have a couple of shelter bunnies that we have adopted and are raising. And Shelter is a place that has, they have these bunnies available for adoption in Carnation. And I did an entire scene that's Velázquez. It's based off of Velázquez painting. Yeah, and I positioned everybody exactly where they were supposed to be, and I was in it pointing at the woman like I was supposed to. And instead of it being the Velázquez scene, it was called, the painting's called The Spinners. And I staged everything just the way he did. There was the foreground, and then there was the background box back there with people back there. And it was really a hoot. I don't know. I think some people might go, oh, I know what she did. It was maybe mirroring the actual painting a little bit more than I would now. But boy, I go back to lots of paintings where I take whole clumps and go, oh boy, I want to arrange a group of women in exactly that same diagonal, and then I do it. It may not, I don't mimic the whole painting, but in this particular instance I did, and it was so fun. And in fact, she owns the painting. Yeah, I get free bunny sitting service.
Well, I have a question for Peter, if there isn't another one from the audience. It's amazing to me that you can visualize your creatures that you make so clearly in advance, because I look at the parts they're made up of, like parts of a tennis racket and wheels off of furniture, and just the inventive use of materials and reframing them into what's the word, anthropomorphized thing. It's quite something. And I remember I had an art teacher who was always obsessing over the connection points between parts. And do you find that part for you, connecting the pieces together, is a struggle, or it flows, or sometimes both?
Actually, one of the joys for me in making these animal sculptures is they're all different. You know, I'll approach the art making in the studio, and each piece is fresh. And it's a challenge. For instance, the snail, how do I attach a glass piece to a wood piece? How do I weld these pieces of rebar onto another piece and then attach it to the rooster? Do I use epoxy? So it's a challenge using these materials to connect the pieces in a way that will last. And for me, that's part of the challenge, and the interest is figuring out how to connect pieces to other pieces. I use glass and rubber. Sometimes I'll use materials that shouldn't be drilled or shouldn't be broken open because they used to contain oil or whatever. Old gas cans, I want to weld those. So it's a challenge, and it's part of the joy for me.
Do you guys have any questions for each other?
I had a question. Do you envision the animal first and then find the pieces, or the other way around?
It's a combination of both. If I have a show, for instance, I do one every year, an annual show in Santa Cruz, where it's an alphabet of animals from A to Z. So it's 26 animals. So I have a specific list that I've made for myself So I need to come up with parts for an American cheetah. So that kind of constricts the process for me to have a preconceived notion. And that's maybe a third of the animals I do that have that specific intent. The rest, the 2/3, it's more free. The materials tend to tell me what they want to be. So for instance, I'll walk through the studio and there'll be junk piled on 2 workbenches, and there's 3 pieces laying up next to each other, and they kind of jump out and say, well, we would be great as a rooster. So I'll take those pieces and make another little pile that's the rooster pile, and as I come across a chess piece for a hat or an airplane propeller, I'll add it to the pile. So it's a combination of a list I've imposed on myself and then just letting the material tell me what it wants to be.
Be kind of cool to see a time-lapse photography version of the animal becoming itself.
Some pieces take maybe a day to come to fruition, others take 8-9 months. I'll have maybe a dozen pieces at any given time in various stages of being worked on. So if one doesn't work out or I'm not inspired, there's 11 other pieces that I can focus on.
Same question.
In one of the jobs I did, I was an academic counselor, and one of the frustrating parts about working with students who wanted to go into the fine arts, particularly they wanted to draw, paint, whatever, is that their parents dissuaded them from that because you couldn't make any money. I have a granddaughter that's in that position too, and I actually think very differently. And I would talk to them about what they did when they were really little, when no one was watching, what they gravitated to. But my question for you is, all of you is, what would you tell a relative or a student that came to you and said, I'm an artist, I want to draw, I want to paint, I want to sculpt, but my parents told me I can't make money in that and I should major in computers or business. What would you tell me?
I have an answer to that, I'm sure you both do. I had a professor in my undergrad days in the anthropology department who, much to my shock, said, you probably are not going to make money as an anthropologist. You should get a job somewhere else, like financing or banking or whatever it was, and do anthropology on the side, because you probably won't make a living at it. And that's probably true in this day and age, that I certainly haven't been able to make an income solely from art. I think artists who can are lucky. So if I had a piece of advice to give to a student or to myself 40 years ago, it would have been keep doing art, irregardless of the situation, and figure out a way to make money, but do the 2 together. I think over the years, I've tended to put more focus in making money. Obviously, it's an imperative to the expense of not making art. So if you can find a balance between the 2, I think that would be an ideal situation.
I say we need a paradigm shift. I don't know how that's going to happen, but we change the culture so that people can do what they are best at doing, because then you don't have to motivate them to do it. They do it and they make money and they can make a living, because we have a different way of looking at money and economy and living.
I think so too. I would agree with Peter. I think that you need some money to survive, but I think what happens too is if you will find the lifestyle that you need in order to accommodate both. If you just went ahead and did it, you would learn to pinch and tuck here where needed to pursue what it is that you want to do. I myself ended up as a computer science major and was a software engineer for over 20 years. And I could not hardly stand the industry. It was fun when I was going to college, but when you got into the industry, I hated it. And so it is, and I continue to do art all through, I took classes on the weekend, I took classes in the evening. It became a therapy for me. And when I finally saw my 5th company go under, owing me thousands of dollars of back pay, I said, I'm done. And I leaped right into an atelier, became horribly poor. But I have a really rich life now. I can't, there are times I go to bed and I'm like, I can't wait to wake up in the morning because I just know I'm going to love painting that part of my painting, and it's so exciting. It's a hard industry to make a living in, and so I don't, along with everybody else. I teach. You can work at museums. You can open a gallery. I mean, there's many ways to maybe still become an artist or be in the arts, if you will. You can. There's many things I think you can do. I haven't myself yet pursued. Maybe I want to be a curator at a museum, or I want to curate a show that I put on as a pop-up show, things like that. There's lots of arts organizations that you can get into that would put up such things, but I myself, I can't. I'm going to probably just paint my way to the end of my life. I have a paintbrush in my hand 90% of the time now. I just love it. I love it to pieces. So if somebody literally came up with that question, you know, a younger person, and said, what do I do? I would give the same advice as Peter. I would say, hang on to your art. Hang on to it. Hang on to it. You will need to find a living that you can accommodate your lifestyle that you've chosen. So make enough money that you can survive. Learn how poor can you be and still manage. Go to the art garage sales and get the cheap supplies and do your thing. So that's my.
Yeah, I echo what has been said. After teaching, well, combined with teaching, I tested software also. And I never felt like I belonged in that world. It was a great experience, but I couldn't sit still. So I would be up from my chair, and all the time.
Were you making art during that?
Yes.
time too?
I've been making art since I was a little kid, and it's like the balance changed, and what you said about learning to live according to your means, got really good at that. So.
And I like to think of it as a life skill that you learn as an artist. I think artists have the tools to become great problem solvers, no matter what the problem is at hand. So it builds a kind of resiliency that helps you sort of on the fly figure out whatever's in front of you. So that's my case I make.
Can I amend my answer to your question? Play the lottery. And/or marry into wealth.
Wait a second.
Marry into wealth.
Marry into well.
Neither of which I've done.
I'm reminded of listening to fellow panelists. I'm reminded of something that the poet James Dickey said. He worked for, I think, an ad agency selling soda pop. He had the Coca-Cola account or whatever, and he did this to make money, to raise a family. But at some point, he determined that he needed to do what he needed to do, which was right, and that he needed to jettison the selling of the soda pop. So we may have all come to that. At some point, maybe artists have that point, or several of those in their lifetime, where they decide, am I going to not do art and make money and live a life, or am I going to suffer for the decisions?
think that's true of some scientists too. Was it Einstein who
Yes.
worked for the patent office?
Yeah.
Great question. Any other questions?
Excellent.
How are we on time? Oh, here's a question.
And that's just not time.
Oh,
I'd like to know how each of you were as children, as artist children. What did you do? What were you interested in?
I wrote a children's book. It was a picture book where two little fellows were in a sailboat and the sun was out, you know, the round thing in the sky, and it was just classically childlike. And then they hoisted up their little flag, and along came a green sea serpent in the water, and then there was thunder and lightning happening in the sky, and the sea serpent was wrapped around, and one of the fellas proceeded to take a knife and killed the serpent. So then there was lots of red, and then the serpent was limp in the boat, and the guys were like, "Yay, we won!" So I put this all on my, I stapled it together. I think my mom threw it away finally. But so, and I drew a lot when I was a kid. I drew out of my mind, and I kind of continued to do that. I have a stack of sketchbooks. They're pretty horrific when I look back at them, but I remember that as a kid. And then I did one thing that was really unusual. My parents had a library downstairs, all kinds of books and art books. And I opened up one to a Madonna and Child scene. It was a charcoal sketch, and I copied that charcoal sketch, blew my parents away, and that was it. It wasn't, I wouldn't say that there wasn't encouragement, but just, there wasn't that much encouragement to pursue that. But nevertheless, so anyway, I still kind of do this, and I feel like a grown-up child. I'm doing the same thing. I draw in my sketchbooks all the time, and I'm making charcoal sketches occasionally from the classics. So.
I was sent off to art classes as a little kid, so I always had my hands in something, whether it was a lot of it was, you know, crafts, like pottery or sculpture, and I also went to camp, day camp, overnight camp, and so there were always art-related activities, so yeah, I've had my hands in stuff forever. But I've never been a realistic painter, you know. It's always been more abstract, yeah.
Well, as a child, to me the most important part of a garment was how big the pockets. Because I would, like my collecting of materials today, in giant plastic tubs, my pockets would be stuffed with bits and pieces of everything that I'd encountered. And also the early photos of myself, I always had a paper bag with me. It had, once again, the treasures that I would collect, and the bag would wear out, and I'd go get another bag. So, like it is today, when I was a child, it had to deal with, started with the collecting of stuff. Oh, and I like taking things apart, so around my house growing up, you'd hear my father say, "Where the hell's the toaster?" Because I took it apart for the parts, so I used to say, you know, I need to cut the grass, and the lawnmower is in 1,000 pieces. It was a combination of heavy pockets and being asked, what happened to those appliances?
That's great. More questions? Okay, I have one more question. I think most people who do creative work, most people in general have like that self-critical voice inside your head? Do you have a, I don't know, forceful relationship with that voice, any of you? Or do you have strategies that you use to have it not get in your way?
Should I go first? It's probably a problem that plagues most artists is the self-doubt. And going back to an earlier question about raising, having an income, there's always the voice, at least in my experience, of, I don't know if it's my parents or the parent within me that says, well, shouldn't you be doing something productive? And you should give up those silly activities because this is not what adults do. What do you mean you're gluing junk to other pieces of junk? Get out there and make money or cut the grass or paint the house or whatever. So there's always that little voice that says, whispers in your ear the self-doubt. And for me, it didn't really work to ignore it. I think at this point in my life, I've come to an agreement that will both coexist and or I'll chase it down and put duct tape over its mouth. I don't have to listen to that little voice anymore.
I like it.
I got so interested in listening to you, I've forgotten the question. The critic, yeah. Sometimes what I do is I'll take a class. I think I'm going to be a perpetual student, which a lot of artists end up becoming as well, as you're constantly learning from people around you. And I'll take a class from somebody that is just really going to push me out of my box. And I found it to be really helpful. It's a bit of a struggle sometimes because I'm just like my students complaining, why didn't this work out? Well, that happens to me. I take a class and I'm out of my box and I fail miserably, but I always have come back stronger. I always have broken through something, and that helps me a lot, is to, have somebody help push me past, to take a risk at something that the critic would ordinarily say, no, play it safe. Got a show coming up, don't do something stupid. And I'm like, no, I really want to do something stupid right now. I want to try just putting a plug of paint here just because it feels like it needs to be there. So that's one way that I've been able to silence that voice. But the voice is always there. And the other thing I've learned to do is, not everything works out. You can put up with that a little bit in life. I mean, it's okay. Every painting isn't, none of my paintings will ever be a masterpiece. So, some are better than others, and the ones that don't survive, they get turned upside down and I paint on top of them. And then I have that rich background to react against. And maybe I'll end up an abstract painter that way, who knows?
I have so much self-criticism in so many areas of my life. It's not really limited to art. Yeah. So I'm not sure how to answer this question, except I go through periods where I'm not inspired, where I feel like, oh, yeah, will I ever have a creative impulse again? And those are hard times. But I'm learning how to ride the waves better as I age. Yeah, so.
I talked to a lot of people during COVID who just lost the impulse to make during that time because it was so overwhelming. Oh, one last question.
So I'm just curious, when you've lost inspiration, what do you do to get it back?
Sometimes I just start working, just even if I don't feel like, like make a plate with the same design as another, because a lot of my stuff is one of a kind. I don't use a wheel, I hand build, so I don't do production work. So if I'm uninspired, I might go, oh, I'm just going to make that thing again, and then it gets me it can get me going. Also, I work in so many mediums that if I just switch to another medium or think about, oh, like right now, I feel like this is in real time right now. I want to design scarves or bandanas, like maybe take one of those collages and put it onto a scarf or a bandana, so I can get re-inspired by thinking about a new product.
Well, thank you guys so much for sharing your thoughts and stories with us. We really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you all so much for coming. Please stop in between June 7th and June 30th to see Introducing, a group exhibition of Bainbridge Arts and Crafts' newest artists.